Leo Tolstoy's Resurrection is a scathing indictment of injustice, corruption and hypocrisy at all levels of society. Creating a vast panorama of Russian life, from peasants to aristocrats, bureaucrats to convicts, it reveals Tolstoy's magnificent storytelling powers. The book is very political in nature, with Tolstoy explicitly criticizes the form of government and economics in late 19th century Russia. It is almost preaching to socialism, as Tolstoy presents all the evils coming from rich capitalists, who use the people for their own good, while most of the population starves and lives in poverty. Dmitry Nekhlyudov, a nobleman, is summoned to serve on the jury in criminal court. As the prisoners brought in, he is shocked to recognize one of them, a woman he once loved. Katusha was a common girl raised by Nekhlyudov's rich aunts. She was only 16 when Nekhlyudov had seduced her during one of his visits. She had gotten pregnant and gave birth to a child who later died in a hospital for foundlings. Nekhlyudov had no intention to marry Katusha. He had quickly forgotten about the affair and went on with his life. Now he learns that what was only a brief adventure to him had ruined Katusha's whole life. She is now a prostitute, charged with theft and poisoning. The jury finds her not guilty of theft and believes that while she may have administered the poison, she did so unknowingly. However, the jury inadvertently fails to put the words, "no intent to take life," in the verdict, and Katusha is sentenced to hard labor in Siberia. Realizing that he was the one who pushed Katusha onto the wrong path and feeling guilty, Nekhlyudov attempts to correct the mistake, but there is not much he can do. His conscience awakes, he goes through a deep transformation. He decides to follow Katusha to Siberia and to marry her. It is on this journey to save her and himself, he begins to see the life below him and his aristocracy, and the resurrection begins. He goes to visit her in prison, meets other prisoners, hears their stories, and slowly comes to realize that below his gilded aristocratic world, yet invisible to it, is a much larger world of cruelty, injustice and suffering. Story after story he hears and even sees people chained without cause, beaten without cause, immured in dungeons for life without cause, and a 12-year-old boy sleeping in a lake of human dung from an overflowing latrine because there is no other place on the prison floor, but clinging in a vain search for love to the leg of the man next to him. Until the book achieves the bizarre intensity of a horrific fever dream. He decides to give up his property and pass ownership on to his peasants, leaving them to argue over the different ways in which they can organize the estate, and he follows Katyusha into exile, planning on marrying her. On their long journey into Siberia, she falls in love with another man, and Nekhlyudov gives his blessing and still chooses to live as part of the penal community, seeking redemption. According to Tolstoy, the things that one considers to be good and evil largely depend on the circle in which one is moving. In Resurrection, Leo Tolstoy defends this argument by indicating that people, who by the majority would be considered to be evil, do not always consider themselves as such, because they move in circles that advocate their specific modes of life. Leo Tolstoy writes, "People whom fate and sin mistakes have placed in a certain position, however false that position may be, form a view of life in general which makes their position seem good and admissible. In order to keep up their view of life, these people instinctively keep to the circle of those people who share their views of life and their own place in it." Tolstoy indicates that this might appear rather strange to most people. However, according to Tolstoy, this is only the case because most people do not move in these circles. As he says, this surprises us only because the circle, the atmosphere in which these people live, is limited, and we are outside it. Even more interesting, Tolstoy argues that most people, who consider themselves to be good, are doing the exact same thing as the people that most people consider to be bad. Leo Tolstoy writes, "But can we not observe the same phenomenon when the rich boast of their wealth obtained from robbery, the commanders in the army pride themselves on victories over murder, and those in high places vaunt their power with violence? We do not see the perversion in the views of life held by these people, only because the circle formed by them is more extensive, and we ourselves are moving inside of it. As such, it can be argued that what one considers to be good or bad largely depends on the circle in which one is moving. This would mean that there is no absolute good or evil, only relative good and evil." Through the character Nekhlyudov, Leo Tolstoy argues that everyone has two personalities, his or her animal personality and his or her spiritual personality. In Resurrection, Leo Tolstoy observed that the animal personality is always looking for easy gratifications. It is gratified by following the customs of society and adapting oneself to these customs. Following one's spiritual life is more complicated because one must make every decision for oneself, instead of simply behaving as society expects one to behave. Tolstoy's character Nekhlyudov noticed that when he tried to do something that was better for his spiritual side, such as drinking less wine, spending less money on luxuries or being kind to the less fortunate, society frowned upon this behavior. At the same time, when Nekhlyudov drank a lot and spent his money on luxuries, society greeted this behavior with approval. When he considered it right to limit his needs, wore an old overcoat, took no wine, everybody thought it strange and looked upon it as a kind of showing off, but when he spent large sums on hunting or on furnishing a peculiar and luxurious story for himself, everybody admired his taste and gave him expensive presents to encourage his hobby. As such, it is easier, according to Tolstoy, to take better care of one's animal personality. One does not have to make any complicated decisions for oneself because one can simply follow what everyone in society does, and one will not be frowned upon by society for being different. However, according to Tolstoy, by only listening to one's animal personality one might negatively influence the happiness of the world in general. Tolstoy writes, in Nekhlyudov, as in every man, there were two beings, one the spiritual, seeking only that kinds of happiness for himself which should tend towards the happiness of all, the other, the animal man, seeking only his own happiness, and ready to sacrifice to it the happiness of the rest of the world. Even though society promotes the development of the animal personality, it is the animal personality that can eventually negatively impact society. As such, by only promoting the development of the animal personality, society can be seen as a corruptive force. In Resurrection, Leo Tolstoy proposes that it is almost impossible for any one person to have certain fixed characteristics. Tolstoy writes, one of the most widespread superstitions is that every man has his own special, definite qualities, that a man is kind, cruel, wise, stupid, energetic, apathetic. Tolstoy indicates that it is possible for certain individuals to more often be wise than stupid, for example, but it is not possible for anyone to always be stupid or wise. It would be false to say of one man that he is kind and wise, of another that he is wicked and foolish. And yet we always classify mankind in this way. Instead, Tolstoy argues that men are like rivers. Every man or woman has in him or herself all the attributes that can possibly exist, but some people show certain attributes more than others. Tolstoy writes, men are like rivers, the water is the same in each, and alike in all, but every river is narrow here, is more rapid there, here slower, there broader, now clear, now cold, now dull, now warm. It is the same with men. Every man carries in himself the germs of every human quality, and sometimes one manifests itself, sometimes another, and the man often becomes unlike himself, while still remaining the same man. It can be a pleasant idea to always consider oneself like a river. If one considers oneself to be smart, one does not have to beat oneself up for doing something stupid, because being stupid is an attribute carried by all. Similarly, if one considers oneself as someone who is always happy, one does not have to worry if one is sometimes unhappy. Unhappiness is also an attribute carried by all. It all just depends on how the river flows. On the last page of his last novel, Leo Tolstoy, arguably the greatest author to have ever existed, made an interesting argument. In Resurrection, Leo Tolstoy indicated that we do not live only for our own joy. Furthermore, if we were to live solely for our own joy, Tolstoy argued that it would make us unhappy. Tolstoy writes, this evidently is an incongruity. We were sent here by someone's will and for some reason. And we have concluded that we live only for our own joy, and of course we feel unhappy. Tolstoy thereby argued that everyone should have an additional purpose in life, besides living for one's joy. Although I believe Tolstoy considered religion an important addition, everyone can find their own additional purpose. The novel is a strong attack on the criminal justice system. The miscarriage of justice was only a tool for Tolstoy to probe into the defects and abuses of power within the institutions that exercised criminal justice. It also allowed Tolstoy to expose the appalling conditions of the prisons and the degradations to which prisoners were subjected. This revelation is truly shocking. It looks as if the Russian criminal justice system was running on the whims and fancies of the upper-class men who thought it just to condemn those who were not on par with them either in class or in views. Resurrection is both a story and a social commentary. While the main story portrays the shallowness of the idle upper-class nobility and their sickening misconducts towards those who are below them in class, it also serves as a means to expose the judicial and social injustice, especially towards the lower classes, and bureaucratic callousness in general. Tolstoy brings out all these with so much power and in detail. When he tells the story of Katusha, her sufferings, her fall in society, he tells it with such warmth. Tolstoy writes, "All this terrible change had come about because he had ceased to believe himself and had taken to believing others. This he had done because it was too difficult to live believing oneself. One had to decide every question, not in favor of one's animal I, which is always seeking for easy gratification, but in almost every case against it. Believing others, there was nothing to decide, everything had been decided already, and always in favor of the animal I and against the spiritual. Nor was this all. Believing in his own self, he was always exposing himself to the censure of those around him. Believing others, he had their approval.